Good afternoon, welcome. I'm Bronwen Maddox, Director of the Institute for Government. Delighted to welcome Sir Simon Fraser to have this in-conversation on Brexit and where we are now. Simon was, as you know, former Permanent Under-Secretary of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and also Head of the Diplomatic Service, and has served as, before that, Permanent Secretary of the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills and Chef de Cabinet for Peter Mandelson when he was Trade Commissioner, and indeed Director General of Europe and Globalisation at the FCO as well. Since leaving the Foreign Office, Simon has set up a company, Flint Global, and he and his team advise companies on the issues they encounter at the interface with government and regulators, much of which I think is now suddenly to do with Brexit.
That is true.
Like many people found a sudden injection of into your line of work from this upheaval. Well, look, we're delighted to be having this conversation. It could be at any point in the past few months, but it does keep moving very fast. And I thought, Simon, we could start by asking what your view is. After the Conservative Party conference, after the past 10 days of manoeuvring, where are we now in forming a sense of what the UK's options are?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and putting me in front of such an intimidating audience. When I look around this room, I see a lot of people who know an awful lot about many of the aspects of this issue. So we will try to have the discussion at the appropriate level. On this question, I think since the Conservative Party conference, we're beginning to get a clearer picture of the way things are heading in political terms, i.e. on the UK side at the moment, a very clear sense that we are heading for what you might call the harder end of the Brexit spectrum, that it is less likely that we will be pursuing an option which keeps us within the single market because of the primacy that's being given to the issues around sovereignty relating to freedom of movement and indeed the authority of the European Court of Justice. So there's been a sort of hardening of the perceived British position, and that has been responded to on the European side by some pretty hardline statements coming out of Europe saying, well, you can't expect any favours, and if you're going to go down that course, then it's going to be a tough negotiation for the UK. So that's where I think we are, and that's the mood at the moment. The only thing I would say, Bronwen, is this is going to be a long process, and we are actually not even at the start of the negotiation yet. We are in a pre-negotiation phase, and it's not surprising, therefore, that everybody is taking pre-negotiating positions. That's what happens in negotiations. So personally, whilst I wouldn't want to underestimate the difficulties, I think we ought to just accept that this will be a dynamic process over a period of months and years.
Yeah, we're not even in talks about talks, we're in thoughts about talks about talks.
We're not in talks about talks because the European side and the Commission have expressed this very clearly, have said no negotiation without notification, and of course the government has said we will not notify formally under Article 50 until perhaps the end of March.
Well, taking that qualification, which is absolutely right, and agreed, we're sort of reaching for nuances and interpretations of really not very much in the way of government utterances so far in this. Do you think it's right to say that the government has somewhat downplayed economic considerations in this? This has after all been the story of the last 10 days, not just about personalities and whether or not the Chancellor is fighting action to defend the role of the economy, but we've had comments about from the Home Secretary on companies employing foreign workers, and indeed a sort of backdrop of comments about government's relationship with business that some businesses have not been very keen on at all. Is that fair to say the government is holding economic considerations very much in the balance, or do you think?
I think you have to look back at this. Those who fought the Remain campaign fought it basically on the economic arguments, and they lost the campaign. So those who voted for Brexit were largely motivated, I think, by other reasons. They didn't actually believe some of the things they were told about the economy, but clearly they had other priorities, and therefore it's normal that the government would want to be seen to be responding to those concerns, again about immigration, freedom of movement, about the position of the European Court of Justice, about contributions to the European budget. So I'm not surprised that in the political debate here in the UK, those issues are to the fore. I do think, however, that as we go forward and as we get into the negotiation, not necessarily about the terms of separation from the EU, but about the terms of our future relationship with the EU over a period of time, that the economic questions will inevitably be at the heart of that negotiation.
Right, so let's look at the different stages of where we go from here. How can we break it down?
Well, it's complicated. It's very complicated, and I don't think anybody knows the answers. I think the best thing to do is to try to set out the issues that we're going to have to think through and address. And one way of breaking it down, in my view, is to say there are going to be several sets of negotiations. I can think of four obvious ones. The first is the negotiation under Article 50 for the terms of separation. You know, that is about quite a lot of legal and technical issues, about our participation in European programmes, about the status of British nationals working in the EU, probably things such as the border between Spain and Gibraltar and the issue of the border in Ireland, those sorts of issues, the location of EU bodies in the UK. So that is the first negotiation. Then obviously the next big negotiation, which is linked to that, but is under a different article of the treaty, Article 218, is the negotiation for the future political and economic relationship between the UK and the EU. And that is where the really big issues about membership or access to the single market and so forth will lie. And it's, by the way, it's not only those things, it's also cooperation in foreign policy, security policy,
it's not just trade,
policy.
even though we talk a lot about that.
It's not just economics, but that's at the heart of it. So that's two big negotiations. The first should be done in 2 years, maybe. The second, I think, inevitably will take longer. And that leads to the third negotiation, which I think we're going to face, which is some sort of interim arrangement between leaving and establishing the long-term permanent relationship between us. And this is something which is becoming more prominent in public debate at the moment as people begin to think this through. And fourthly, of course, there's the set of negotiations that this country will conduct then with other countries outside Europe about our trade relationships, the agenda that Liam Fox is in charge of, international trade, as we have our own external trade policies leaving the EU. So, there are many complexities within those groups, but that's one way of thinking about the structure of the overall tasks ahead.
Let's start with the Article 50 and the declaring the Article 50 and the where we go from there. Do you think we can really get very far with that, given the French and German elections that are coming?
So first of all, I think the Prime Minister has played her hand well on this, because I think it was necessary to create some space to do some serious thinking about what Article 50 means. As we all know, we went into this referendum without really having done a lot of detailed thinking about the implications of a vote to leave. So that thinking has not been done and needs to be done. And the task for Whitehall this autumn, in my view, and Westminster, is to actually get their heads down and do the hard policy thinking about the issues that are going to be prominent in the negotiation, both the leaving negotiation and the future negotiation. So I think she was right to postpone it. I don't think she could have postponed it politically myself beyond next March. But I think the political timetable is a sensible one. What I expect will happen is that we will trigger at some point in the first quarter of next year, and a negotiation will begin. But what will that negotiation be? Well, the first phase will be that we will presumably, in triggering, make a statement to the EU about what the terms of the negotiation are in our view and what we're seeking to achieve. And at that point, they will then come together and there will be a discussion about the framework of the negotiation and their position on the negotiation. They have said that they will not formally engage in that process until we've triggered. I suspect there will be informal pre-consultation without doubt. So the first phase of the negotiation will be a sort of scoping negotiation. And of course you'll then have the French election coming
which is April and May.
April and May, and then in June there's a Assemblée Nationale. And then of course the German election comes after
which
the
is
summer.
August, September. Yep.
So my guess would be that the negotiations will begin, but the serious hard end at the political level will happen later in the year, next year, rather than earlier.
All right, so that pushes the start of these negotiations just on this first bit about leaving, right to the end of next year, 2017. Leaving 2018 is the time to get into the meat of it, which is not very much time.
And into 2019, yes, but of course an awful lot of ground clearing can be done, because these negotiations are going to be done at different levels. But clearly there's going to be an awful lot of technical level work to be done across all these issues, and officials will have to get on with that, obviously under guidance from ministers. But I don't think it's realistic, I mean I may be wrong, but I don't think it's realistic to expect that ministers are going to be leading all the negotiation process throughout this whole thing. So you can think of ways in which it can be done in phases, with officials meeting and then coming back and reporting to ministers. And if that happens, then a lot of ground clearing and preparatory work, and indeed negotiation at the technical level, can happen before the very serious sort of end game begins.
And has any of that ground clearing, as you put it, has that begun already?
I'm not aware that it has, because as I've said, there's a clear position on the EU side that they're not going to go into a sort of pre-negotiation. And as I said also, I think on the UK side, my understanding, there are probably people in the room in government who know more about this than me, but my understanding is that we are not yet in a position, frankly, to do that, because we haven't put together an overarching view of our negotiating strategy and the priorities within it.
How much sense does it make to try and put together that overarching sense? Is that, I mean, it sounds great. People keep saying, what is the government's negotiating position? But, there's a range of things we want. And we're not really going to know our single position until we begin to know the response.
No, but you have to go into a negotiation, at least privately, not publicly, with a clear sense of where your priorities are, I don't like the word red lines, because they imply a sort of finality about things early in the process, but you need to know where your priorities are.
Very nicely put, I mean,
and what your relative priorities are. You have to have a sort of sense of the overall package that you're thinking about. And I think that government needs to have time to work that out. Now then there's the very important question of how much of that is made public, which of course has been part of the debate recently in Parliament, and not surprisingly, and how you manage that. Because this is obviously a very sensitive international negotiation, but these are also decisions which are of primordial importance for the future of this country, and therefore there's a sort of democratic responsibility, it seems to me, to make sure that the public and Parliament are properly engaged. That is going to be very complicated.
It's extremely hard, as you said, to keep people very engaged and things that fundamentally affect their jobs and their future, and yet to spin out these months of mystery, if I can put David Davis's bit of a strategy that way, and say, look, we need to do this in private.
Well, I mean, this is a very interesting question, and I don't quite know how this is going to play out, and you have to also bear in mind, and we need to talk about this, the EU side of this, because there you have 27 countries and 3 big institutions in Brussels who will be involved in this negotiation. The idea that that's going to happen in private is, I think is a bit optimistic. So there will be a certain flow of information going on. So this is one of the big challenges of this process.
Yes, I mean, it seems to be, it is in so many people's and organisations' interest to make at least parts of this public that hard to think that there won't be partial sort of kind of running commentary, or interested parties are putting bits out there from some country or other.
But just to be clear, and I'm not going to use the running commentary phrase because I think that's been slightly overused, but it does seem to me that government is has a responsibility to make sure that Parliament is properly informed in an appropriate way about what the agenda is and what's happening. And I think the establishment of the Select Committee is a positive move in that sense. And it does seem to me, I'm somebody who's done trade negotiations, and I know how difficult it is if your position is being leaked to the opposing party or the negotiating party. But nevertheless, I do think we've got to have a sort of democratic process around this over the years.
I just want to pick up that point. What do you think the role of the UK Parliament is likely to be in this?
Well, I think that there has to be a level of scrutiny and discussion about the progress. So I think there'll have to be regular reporting back through a negotiating process on what's happening. I think it's going to be at quite a high level.
But you're stopping short of talking about a vote?
Well, I'm talking about transparency during the negotiating process. That's one thing. There's a separate issue, or a linked issue, which is whether there should be a vote and when. This is very sensitive. Of course, there's a legal case at the moment about whether there needs to be a vote to trigger Article 50. Maybe I won't take a firm position on that. My own sense, politically rather than legally, is I'm not sure that is necessary. But I personally, this is a completely personal view, I do not understand how we could go through a multi-year negotiation, at least 2 years, to determine terms on which we leave the EU, and then do that without some sort of parliament, at least parliamentary vote on that. I mean, if you were in a commercial organisation, you would never commit yourself now to accepting the terms of a negotiation on a deal that was going to be finished in 2 years' time. It's simply odd to me. So I don't know how it's going to be done, but it does seem to me that, at the most basic level, that is going to be a requirement.
Well, thanks for that. As you said, we won't prejudge the results of that legal case. Can we just step back to what we were talking about before we got into Parliament and how we conduct these negotiations? What you think our strong cards are, if any?
Well, I mean, our strong cards are that it is in the interest of the European Union to have a constructive relationship with the United Kingdom and a positive economic relationship with the United Kingdom in future, and also that the United Kingdom brings assets to the European Union. I mentioned earlier, foreign and defence and security policy. I mean, we are leaders in the EU in that, and I think our absence from the EU would significantly diminish the EU in those areas. So we have strong cards, and I hope that we will play those cards sensibly, because clearly we also have, I believe, a rational economic interest in a positive relationship with the European Union going forward. After all, there's 45% of our trade, and we all know the figures. It's going to remain very important for this country. So, we do have cards to play, and I think that we just have to take this negotiation step by step in a pragmatic way. What I hope we can avoid is getting entrenched into very antagonistic political positions or allowing that to happen, so that there is an atmosphere surrounding the negotiations which makes it more difficult to accentuate the positive as we go along.
There's been a lot of talk in the past few days about whether we could slash corporate tax rates as a negotiating tool.
I mean, clearly one of the things that we're seeking, that those who favour leaving the European Union believed that we should be seeking, and it is an option for us as we leave, is to introduce policies which give us advantages, competitive advantages, deregulation and so forth, which makes this country a very attractive place for business and gives us economic and trading advantage. So I could see that, for example, in the area of tax, we may have new flexibilities available. The only thing that we have to bear in mind is that if we do that, and we are seen to be seeking what might be considered unfair advantages in the trade relationship with Europe, you could expect some sort of reciprocal action of some sort on the other side. So I think we'll just have to think about these things very carefully as we go ahead. But clearly, we should be seeking to improve the flexibility and competitiveness of our economy as part of this negotiation.
How should we ideally approach these talks? Is it like accession negotiations, where you sort of say there's a whole load of chapters and we try and settle some and leave the harder ones perhaps a bit further down the road, or go for more of an overall statement of principles?
So I don't know how it's going to be done. I rather doubt that anybody does at the moment. But if you look at the Article 50 separation negotiation, you could imagine that there would be a sort of statement of intent by the UK, and then it would be broken down into various chunks, if you like, of negotiation around certain issues, and they would be conducted by different groups of different negotiating teams, because obviously there'd be specialists in different areas, and it would be brought together at the end into an overall package which would have to be approved, and there would be, I guess, trade-offs between certain parts of that negotiation at some point. So you could conceive of that as the way that negotiation is conducted. As for the future trade negotiation, it depends what we're going for. I mean, if we are going for a solution which leaves us inside the European single market, which, as I've said, at the moment doesn't look likely, then basically what you've got is a negotiation about keeping that and what the conditions and obligations attached to that would be for the UK in such areas as contribution and freedom of movement, and what the trade-off is. If you're going for an arrangement whereby we leave and then we negotiate a new economic relationship through a free trade or economic agreement, the sort of so-called Canada model, but it's much, much bigger than that, then presumably that might follow the pattern of a classical sort of free trade agreement, and that would mean that you'd have a sort of overall negotiating mandate. You'd have negotiations on different issues iteratively over time between officials, and they'd be brought together at the end into a single agreement. And the classic arrangement, the classic way of approaching those agreements is that in the end nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. It's a sort of overall deal.
All right. Well, the Canadian experience has told us that the pattern of a classic trade deal may be to fall flat at the last minute.
Well, it's complicated, and as this has been pointed out, of course it is complicated, and it's made more complicated by the fact that in recent years it has been recognised that these agreements, which now cover much more than just pure trade in goods, which used to be the case when the Commission led them, and now cover issues such as investment, public procurement, and areas of trade and services, that those are so-called mixed competence agreements in which member states want to be involved in negotiation, and in which the ratification process can involve member state parliaments and indeed regional parliaments, as we're seeing in the case of Canada. So the negotiation and agreement process could be complicated.
Is it conceivable that it's actually might be impossible for us to do a trade deal with the European Union? I mean, other countries have found it essentially impossible, at least to date.
Well, it's true that it's taken a long time. If you look, for example, at the EU-US trade agreement, which I've worked on at various times in my career, it's taken a very long time. But we're starting from a slightly different point, and it depends on political will, because we're starting as members of the European Union, as members of the single market. So we have a common regulatory base. We have, deep integrated economic cooperation. At the moment, we have common sort of external tariffs. So it shouldn't be so difficult, technically, as with some other countries where you're actually starting from separate regimes. I think the difficulty is going to lie, a lot of it's going to lie in the politics of this, and the sort of mismatch between expectations that there may be, plus the individual national interests of member states that they will have in certain areas, which may sort of surface during the negotiation as well. But I don't think we should say it's going to be impossible. I think that would be, we have to be optimistic about this, and we have to look for the positive way through.
You're talking in ways that I'm sure many people find very reassuring about an interim deal. And I know there's been a lot of talk in the British press, the British media in the past few weeks about this. Do you detect an appetite for that in the rest of Europe?
Well, again, you see, the difficulty with that is that Article 50 has this built-in sort of expiry of 2 years, and we can only extend it if the other side agree unanimously to extend it. So it's true, and John Kerr, who wrote it, has pointed this out, that it's not designed to favour the sort of leaving party. I suspect if I was negotiating with the UK, I wouldn't want to give an early signal that I was going to make, focus in a sort of concessionary way on an interim agreement too soon. Because clearly this is a negotiation. We have to remember, and this is really important for us, that the European Union will be negotiating in its own interests, and it will be a tough negotiation, and they will not be at the table trying to find favourable deals for the UK. We have to remember that. I think it's very, that's a significant factor. So it's going to be a tough negotiation. On the other hand, as I've said before, I do believe it is in their interest that we avoid an abrupt rupture in the economic and political relationship between us and Europe. And if we had such a rupture in an unfavourable context, that would make the future negotiation and the future relationship so much more difficult to establish. So I do believe that if this is conducted in a rational way, there is a shared interest in finding a way of bridging the gap, if there is a gap.
There's an enormous if in the middle of that sentence, and of course politics may trump what we think of as rational sitting here talking about it. Just if
That's
we look,
very
if,
possible,
we, if we look at what happens if there isn't an interim deal, or what going to WTO terms would look like, how worrying is that for people like your clients?
Well, I mean, it's worrying for. I think it's worrying for us in terms of our national economy, because it would be a significant change in the terms of trade between the United Kingdom and the European Union, which is our biggest market. It's also technically quite complicated because we actually are not members of the WTO in our own right at the moment. So we would need to go to the WTO.
We're members through the European Union.
The EU.
Yeah.
So we would have to establish, if you like, our own trade schedules in the WTO for the UK. Now, you know,
which is another trade deal.
Well, that could. I mean, I'm not really the deep technical trade expert on this, but my understanding is we could do that simply by saying we want to have the same sort of trade schedules as the EU, and provided that the rest of the WTO agreed to that, we could transpose it as a national schedule. So, but still, that would be an independent. That would be in relation to our trade with others. We would lose the automatic access, tariff-free access to the single market in Europe that we have at the moment.
We'd be dealing with the rest of the single market on WTO, rules, as far as we can tell.
And the issue then is, of course, if you look at people like businesses, the inward investment into the UK could well be affected because so much, as we've seen in the Japanese paper, which I think many people are familiar with, where they wrote down the concerns of Japanese business, that a lot of investment in the UK was done specifically with the objective of gaining access to the European market. That was the clear understanding. And if we actually go to this less favourable terms of trade, then it changes the context for that investment. So I think it's a scenario which, personally, I think we should be seeking to avoid. But that is not the view of everybody.
What should we make of Nicola Sturgeon's request to have it both ways, if I can put it that way, to say, well, look, we want a special deal for Scotland within the UK's deal if we're going to, not invoke, move for a new referendum on Scottish independence?
So it seems to me that the British government, the Westminster government, has to have a negotiation on behalf of the United Kingdom with the European Union, and having separate negotiations doesn't seem to me to be a very practical way ahead. But the corollary of that seems to me that the government is going to have to make sure, if it's going to have acceptance for its negotiating position, that it is catering for the concerns of a whole variety of stakeholders, be it business, be it London, the capital of London, never mind the city of London, and also, of course, the devolved administrations and the nations of the UK. And I think that inclusiveness in the preparation and conduct of the negotiations is going to be one of the big challenges. It's being discussed today. It's a very complicated aspect of it, and clearly we know that there are deep concerns in Scotland, as indeed in London, and there are concerns in Northern Ireland about the implications there, and all those things are going to have to be factored in.
Let's just explore this for a second. I can see what it means if Sadiq Khan says, look, London, and particularly the City of London, has got particular concerns in this. Can you please make sure that these are fairly high up your list of priorities? But that seems rather different to me from Nicola Sturgeon saying, well, look, Scotland voted very heavily for staying in the European Union, and we want to be part of the single market, even if you, the rest of the UK, decide that you're not part of the single market. And that surely is much, much harder to work with.
I think it is very hard to work with, but I think we've got to see how the process of negotiation is set up and how that voice is expressed in the negotiation. And in the end, it goes back to the point about whether the ultimate deal is going to be deemed to be acceptable to people in the United Kingdom and in all parts of the United Kingdom, and that will be part of the process as it plays out. And so just picking up that point, if the deal finally were not acceptable to people in Britain and they felt, look, actually there isn't enormous backing for the deal as finally proposed, is it reversible? I just don't think I should speculate on that. There's a tremendous amount that I think is going to happen between now and whenever we get to the end of this process, or indeed these processes. And some of that's going to happen in this country, because I think we are going to begin to see, the economic consequences of the Brexit vote feeding through, and people will begin to understand those more. I think it's equally important to understand there will be changes on the continent of Europe, I expect. There's an awful lot to happen there. And I'm not sure that the EU has really yet absorbed the shock of Brexit and reacted to that and understood its consequences. So, I wouldn't want to say that the EU has been in denial, but I don't think there's been a lot of deep thinking yet about what this means for the future of the EU. Now, as the political events of next year unfold, that may come through as well. So, I personally don't think it's very sensible at the moment to spend too much time speculating about the ifs and whats of a theoretical endpoint. And I'm in good company here, because I was at an event last week which Herman van Rompuy was talking at, and he said, and I thought this was wise of him, he said the only thing we can do in these circumstances is to take this incrementally, work it through step by step and see where it takes us, because we are on a journey to an unknown destination. And I think we have to accept that, frankly.
Thanks very much. Well, on that point, let's go to questions, which I think there are going to be quite a lot. We'll start here on the aisle.
It's an American, so I speak really loud anyways. Ali Renison, I head up EU and trade policy for the IOD. I have a question about parallelism, because there's been a lot of assumptions that the withdrawal agreement would be done in tandem with the negotiation of a new framework of relations between the UK and the EU. You did have Cecilia Malmström right after the referendum saying, no, it has to be a sort of vacuum. But if you look at Article 50, really, it says, this is an incentive for the UK to make sure that the final package deal is voted on incorporates all of those things, so that if anyone voted no, they'd be voting down not just one element, but the whole thing.
So you're talking about parallelism between the
between the withdrawal agreement and the negotiation of the new framework, because some of the things covered cross sections.
The original position taken very clearly by the European Commission was you cannot begin the negotiation on the future relationship until you have finished the negotiation on the separation. Personally, I think that is completely unrealistic politically, and also it's not actually a reflection of the treaty, because if you look at Article 50, it says that Article 50 were negotiated taking account of the future relationship. So I think that there will be an overlap between the two, but I don't actually, to be honest with you, know how that's going to play out. Because I think we will start the Article 50 negotiation, and we will have somehow to sort of begin the negotiation on the future relationship as that goes along. And that will be potentially confused by the interim arrangement as well. I don't know when, and maybe somebody in the room has got a better view on this than me, but when that negotiation on the future relationship will actually start, far less when it will finish.
Thank you. One here in the front.
Wait, sorry.
Here, and then coming to...
The referendum was rather close, and it is possible that the public opinion may move before we get to Article 50. And how would the government respond to that?
Well, I really don't want to speculate on that, because I think that those of us, including me, who were in favour of remaining in the EU, need to accept now that this is the result of the referendum and get on with it. And we should be loyal in that. Those who are in government and those like me who have been in government, and we need to accept that. So it is possible that public opinion in this country may evolve over a period of time as events happen. I don't know. But there's no a priori reason to expect that will be the case. It's also true that public opinion in Europe about the relationship that they want with the United Kingdom could evolve over time and become less hard. So it goes back to my point that I think we have to take this in incremental steps. But I don't think that the government should be working at all at the moment on the assumption that public opinion will change, and they clearly aren't. And we are going forward with the process of leaving the European Union, and that is the only option politically that is available, and I think it has to be done in good faith. And if there are people who believe that they would like to reverse the decision, and I'm not putting myself in that group, then the worst thing they could do at this point is to start making the case and suggesting that that's going to be the case, because I think, it behoves us all to accept the outcome.
Thanks for that. Over here.
Yes, John Peet from The Economist. I wonder if whether you have views on what will happen in Brussels, and particularly whether the UK can influence what happens in Brussels. I mean, if I can caricature the three institutions, the Parliament will be the least helpful, the Commission second least helpful, and the Council might be the most helpful. Is there any way we can try and make sure that this is handled more by the Council than by the other two institutions?
Well, I'm glad you raised it, John, because I think there's a really important point, and again, there isn't enough attention given to this in the UK debate, if the UK side is complicated, and we've just been discussing how complicated it is, the EU side is more complicated, potentially, and actually, because you have, as I said before, you have 27 countries, you have all these institutions, and it's going to be very complex to bring that together. So we need to bear that in mind. Now, my understanding of the way the negotiation will be conducted is that certainly on the negotiation for the future economic and trading relationship, clearly the Commission is going to be at the heart of that. Why? Because that's actually, most of that is the sort of heart of Commission competence under the treaties, through DG Trade, Internal Market and so forth. Second, because the Commission is actually the organisation in Brussels that has the capacity, technical skills and resources to conduct those negotiations. And thirdly, because the Member States are going to have to funnel together their positions through a single negotiating voice, if you like, and that is likely to be the Commission. So I expect the Commission to be the primary negotiating body on the EU side. Now, they will be operating under the mandate of the Council, and the Council will also be involved, or certainly intends to be involved, through the person of Didier Seuss, who's been appointed as the lead negotiator of the Council, in the negotiations. I don't think yet that they have a clear view on how that's going to be structured. My understanding is that the European Parliament will not be in the negotiating team, but clearly wants to be involved in the process, the setting of the mandate, the scrutiny of the process, and of course has a voice and a vote, I believe, on the final deal. So we could get a deal and then the European Parliament says this is not good enough, or actually I think can refer it to the ECJ.
Yeah.
It is complicated and it will be difficult. Now, what's happened in Brussels at the moment is actually, I think, not a hell of a lot, but a team has been put together under Michel Barnier, a sort of a Brexit task force in the Commission, and is being staffed by people in the Commission, and that will be the sort of core of the team. But presumably, rather like the department here for exiting the EU, David Davis' department, will actually sort of have a coordinating function, and we'll have to draw on the expertise of different parts of the Commission, and indeed talking to the Council in order to formulate positions and also get negotiating expertise to the table.
Thanks for that. Let's go. Come over here.
Alistair Smith, CMA. You said that exiting in 2019 on WTO terms would be economically very difficult. It also seems that negotiating a full free trade agreement with the EU by 2019 might be difficult. That seems to say that we definitely will need some kind of interim arrangement. But if it's an interim arrangement for a WTO member who's no longer part of the EU, it has to satisfy WTO rules. We can't have a partial trade deal affecting the car industry without a full WTO compliant free trade arrangement. How do we arrange that?
So I don't know. It's a very good question, because there's a lot of loose talk about this interim arrangement, and there's rather less detailed talk about at the moment about what it might consist of. But my assumption is that what we are talking about here is some sort of continuation of our access in the single market based on the current situation, rather than the negotiation of a completely new agreement in the interim arrangement. And actually, if you look at the Great Repeal Bill, which is due to be introduced when Article 50 is completed, what does that actually do in effect? It translates EU law into UK law, thereby giving us the legal basis I assume, for potentially continuing that relationship on the basis of the content of existing EU law as applied in the UK. And then, of course, later on, the idea is that we might want to disapply parts of that or introduce new areas of EU legislation. So my interpretation of that was that it was a very clear signal from the government that EU law would be discontinued, its application in this country, but at the same time, it provides a basis for ongoing legal certainty, which I think is a good thing.
Thanks. One just here.
Thank you very much. Francis D'Souza. If the negotiations, albeit incremental ones, go reasonably smoothly in the next few years, do you think that in itself might encourage other European nations to consider doing a Brexit? And if that might be something that could happen, would it have an influence on the negotiations themselves as they go along?
Well, I think that one of the objectives of the European Union side will be to make it absolutely clear to anybody else who's considering leaving that that's not a good idea. Which is why I do believe, I'm not a catastrophist, but let's be clear, this is going to be incredibly difficult and complicated and complex and tough as a negotiation. So when you talk about it going smoothly, I think it's possible to conceive of a sort of clear negotiating roadmap, if you like, which we'll follow, but I think it's going to be difficult. And it's absolutely clear on the EU side that for them, the UK leaving the EU there has to be a price tag attached to it. And I think, are going to have to accept that. There is, in terms of our economic position in relation to the European market, there will be a price tag. And in terms of our political involvement with other European member states, we will have less automatic involvement in that than in future. Now, that is, I think, inevitable, and therefore should discourage others. That's what they will seek from pursuing the same path. It may not, because it's clear that there are other countries in Europe which have serious concerns about the way that the European Union is being run. And it's clear that in public opinion in a number of countries, there are concerns similar to those that lay behind, I believe, the Brexit vote. So I think it will be politically complicated on their side. But in EU terms, there has to be a price tag for leaving. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there won't be other opportunities and potential benefits for the UK as we leave the EU, and those who favoured leaving believe that to be the case, and that remains to be seen over time.
Thanks. On the aisle, sorry, behind you, Kerry, there's a very patient gentleman there, and then we'll...
Thank you. First time being called that. Dave Penman, General Secretary of the FDA. Simon, you've just described there what an incredibly difficult and complex process this is going to be. And in advance of the first debate that IFG did about Brexit, they published a series of facts. One of them was that your old department faces a 45% cut in day-to-day spending between now and the end of this Parliament. So if that's not addressed, if there are no more resources, and of course there are similar situations faced across government, does it threaten the success of the Brexit process and the ability of the civil service to support a successful outcome?
That's very interesting. Thank you.
So am I allowed to use this as an occasion to sort of publicise a lecture I'm giving on the 7th of November?
Worse things have been done in this room.
On the issue of can we continue to exert global influence after Brexit under the auspices of King's College. So enough of the publicity, but it's an important point.
And your answer is it yes or no?
And I think that clearly we've got to look at that question. If we're going to be effective internationally, not only in negotiating new economic relationships, but also conducting a sort of global foreign policy, which I assume this country will still want to do. I mean, it's not necessarily the case, but I rather suspect that when we face the choice of do you want to be like Singapore or Norway or a sort of version of the UK, we'll probably want to be a version of the UK. And therefore we will have an ambition to be a global player and to have we'll still be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and we will still want to have a very strong relationship with the United States and be influential in NATO and all these things. And clearly, the fact that we will no longer be in the EU will, I think, remove one of the sort of very powerful instruments of international leverage that we have in our international policy. So we will have to work harder, I suspect, in future to achieve that role. And that needs resources behind it. And I am on the record as saying that I think that the hollowing out of the Foreign Office's budget over recent years has reached a point where it threatens the capacity of our diplomatic network really to operate as effectively as we want it to. And I think that's going to have to be reviewed. And you know, there is, I don't like to put this on the table, but if you look at the balance between what we spend on international aid and what we spend on our own diplomacy around the world, you sort of ask the question as to whether that is in proportion. Now, I know that's a very sensitive debate, but I think it's interesting. The other thing is we now have a new Department for International Trade. So we have that department, the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence, DFID, and other departments conducting aspects of international policy on behalf of this country. And I wonder whether...
And the Brexit department.
And the Brexit department in Europe. And I just wonder whether we are going to have to look at the sort of overall structure of our international effort. But there's more to be said on that on the 7th of November.
Yeah. And you've painted quite an optimistic picture that these things that we want, and you've listed all these things that we quite reasonably, you know, probably are going to still want after all this, but it doesn't mean that we'll get them. I mean, the reform of the UN Security Council is so complex that no one wants to go near it, but seems to be likely to happen at some point.
Yeah.
And our seat on it then not guaranteed if we have been seen to be diminished in the world.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point, but I'm not sure that's the heart of it. I think the more important issue is how will we continue to exert influence in the world? Now, at the moment, we sit in an incredibly interesting place in this country. We have more instruments of international influence, probably, than any other comparable country because of the organisations we're in, the positions we have inherited in various organisations, you know, our aid budget, our diplomacy, our military capabilities, all be they under pressure. So the question, and above all, we have a sort of convening role between Western nations, so that when the United States wants to talk to Europe, we have this we are the best interpreter of each to the other. But in future, if you're the United States wanting to get Europe on board for something, how would you do that is the question I think we need to think about. And how are we going to assure that this country, if it wishes to, continues to occupy that sort of central role in international affairs which we're used to, and which I think we actually like playing.
Thank you. One over here, and then...
There's one here.
Oh, one here, I beg your pardon, right here. Yeah.
Aaron Yamwa, Treasury. It's not a government spending question.
Good.
I was just interested in a comment you made quite early on that March was about as late as Theresa May could push Article 50 politically, and I just wondered why you thought that was the case, given a lot of sort of commentary suggested after the German and French national elections.
Yes. Well, it's just a personal view that I think the Prime Minister was trying to balance different pressures, and she, quite rightly in my view, wanted to create some time to make sure that things could be thought through before we launched what is actually, you know, the most important negotiation this country has been engaged in, you know, for, I don't know since when, but for many decades. So she was right to do that. On the other hand, there was clearly a demand from those within her party and elsewhere who had voted and supported Brexit for clarity that it was going to be carried through. And this is the sort of totemic, the triggering of Article 50 is the totemic gesture, so I think you could understand that she couldn't delay it forever. And also, of course, there's pressure from other quarters, including business. Business don't like uncertainty. And, you know, a long gap in which nobody's quite sure whether anything's even going to begin, never mind where it's going to end, adds to business uncertainty. So I think that she was balancing those requirements, and it seemed to me a very logical place to come out, where she did come out.
Thank you. Just over there, and then.
Alex Carlisle. Even though the government doesn't want a vote in Parliament on triggering Article 50, there are various means by which Parliament can vote when it feels like it in both houses on all kinds of different aspects of this whole business. If on the merits Parliament were to reject a significant part of the negotiations during their proceedings, what would the effect on the negotiations be?
Well, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen, and you and others in the room are much greater experts than me on the parliamentary procedural and power side of this, and there is the legal case. I mean, I think that my own view is, I think the best thing that can happen now, I'm not saying this is what will happen, because questions such as you pose, raise some very complex questions, but I think the best thing that can happen now is that the Article 50 is triggered and the negotiation begins, and that the government, I assume, I don't know, let me be clear, I don't know, but I assume the government will make a fairly general statement of intent when it triggers Article 50, but it will not be a detailed blueprint for the ultimate objective in the negotiation. And in those contexts, I'm not sure whether there would be enough material in that for Parliament at that point to vote against, a substantial part of it. I just don't know. And one can envisage all sorts of ways in which things can be blocked. I have a feeling that in the interest of the country, we need to find a way of moving forward one way or another. But I do absolutely accept. It is my own personal view is that the more critical point is what happens during and at the end of the negotiation. Sorry, it's not a very precise answer, but I just, it's difficult.
Hi, Emma Downing from the House of Commons Library. It was a question with your work with business, really, and you mentioned the uncertainty. Do you have a sense of, I'm sure it'll be different for every business, but how long business might sort of hold its nerve with the uncertainty, whilst also maybe looking at potential opportunities before they leave, restructure, move to other countries? Do you think there'll be a tipping point when people think, no, we've got to go? It's a very
important question. Obviously, we had a lot of speculation focused mainly on the city and the financial services sector, and we had there was an article this weekend quoting Anthony Brown about the contingency arrangements that some firms were making. I don't know the detail of that. But the broader point for business is that we have to remember that businesses in the end, they may like being in this country, they may like investing in this country, but they make their own choices based on their commercial calculation. And as they say, it's all about optionality in business, and they will be looking at options. There's no doubt about it. That's their job. So there's no doubt that businesses now will be engaged in doing a variety of things, and I have some sort of knowledge of this. First of all, they're trying to understand clearly what the impacts of Brexit could be on their business and different forms of Brexit. So they're trying to also follow the political debate and understand how that's going to play out and what the likely sort of scenarios are. They're also then looking at that and saying, well, what really matters to us, and how can we, in a constructive way, influence that debate? And can we we need to make sure that we are expressing our view to government and indeed to the European side. And I expect that that's a process which will carry on, and I know that the government is reaching out at the moment to the different sectors and talking to them, so that's a good thing. But in the end, they will have to make decisions. And what we're seeing at the moment, if you look at, for example, at investment, is not that people are making decisions to leave, but they're not making decisions to invest at the moment. So it's a sort of chill factor, and we'll see how that goes. Now, there have been some very high-profile investments that have been made. I don't want to deny that. But overall, I think there's a caution about the market here. So I don't think there's any one magic tipping point. I rather see this as a sort of process over time, that we are likely to see sort of decisions being made which add up in aggregate to a picture which will emerge over time. And I think that has to be part of the context, the political context, that has to be borne in mind by the policymakers as we go along.
The 5, 6, 7 years that we might be talking about, even for quite a brisk version of a deal, is a long time in business planning.
Yes, yes, it is. But you know, I mean, the way that businesses are organised is complicated. They may have different sort of their presences in different countries. They can structure their operations in different ways. So I think we shouldn't, as in all these things, I think it's wrong for us to sort of take absolutist and sort of catastrophic views. These will be sort of incremental decisions that are made, their adjustments are made, rather than sort of huge cliff edge decisions that are made. I expect, I may be wrong, it may be that we will have some very dramatic announcements which actually impact very significantly on the debate, but my expectation would be rather different from that, and that, you know, businesses will work around things, but in the long run that may have consequences. We may find that has significant consequences for their presence here and employment here and engagement in the British economy.
Thanks. Here,
Ivo Dorney. The media have very much reported that Article 50, once invoked, is a kind of gate of no return. But there was a rather less remarked on article by, I think, a Commission official called Jean-Claude Pires in the FT, which said that we could complete the Article 50 process and at the end of it, unilaterally from a UK standpoint, just decide not to leave the European Union. What is your view on that?
Just on the last question, I don't want you to give the impression that business is not seriously concerned, because it is. And, you know, this is very serious. But equally, I think we need to just try to understand how this is going to play out. On your point, Ivo, so Jean-Claude Pires, who is the former legal advisor of the European Commission and a very distinguished European lawyer, his view on this, and it's not shared by everybody, but his view is that once we trigger Article 50, if at any point during the process we change our minds and decide to withdraw our Article 50 application, we could do that. That is his view. Some other EU lawyers take the view that once you've started, you have to finish, a bit like sort of mastermind. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the legal answer, but if I look at it politically, I think he must be right. I think it's very doubtful that if
you think he must be right? I actually thought you were going to
no, because if we trigger Article 50 and we start a negotiation, and then we turn around and say after 18 months, and I'm not saying this will happen, but if it did, actually we don't want to leave, I don't imagine the rest of Europe saying, sorry, you've got to leave now. You know, I
can see elements within even the Council, never mind the Commission, which would say exactly that.
Yeah, but I
saying
think
that the point of triggering Article 50 is essentially the exit, and then the negotiations about how you do it.
I don't share that view. I think that in the end, I like to think that in the end politics trumps law in these things. And actually I think in any case, his legal interpretation is a legal interpretation, that it can be done. But you know, it would seem to me to be sort of self-defeating on all sides if that were the decision that were taken here for others who didn't want us to leave in the first place, unless they've decided that actually they really want us to leave. It doesn't seem to me to be logical.
And under Article 50, Article 50, which is about, on this, as informative as a fortune cookie, as John Kerr, who wrote it, as you said, says, it doesn't say very much. But we're not out until which point?
So it's at the end of the
2 years.
Of the 2-year process.
Yes.
We're not out when we trigger it. We are in until the end of the process. So we will formally leave, I assume, by whatever decision-making process we reach at that point in 2019, unless it is extended. But given that you have the new Commission appointed in 2019 and the new European parliamentary election in 2019, if we're leaving, it does seem to me to be the logical point at which to do it.
We've got time for just a couple more. One right at the back. Is there anyone, and then one on the aisle, anyone in the next door room who wants to do the old-fashioned thing of sticking a head round the door?
I'm James Kidner, formerly of the Foreign Office, but currently with a technology startup called Improbable, so spared all these horrors. Could you put yourself back into your old job, Simon, and sell the challenge of joining one of the negotiating teams to up-and-coming civil servants? Because you've painted a pretty bleak picture of what it's going to be like. And what does success look like when you've slaved away for 2 or 3 years in a negotiating thing and you've got such a poor wicket to bat on?
It's interesting how the Foreign Office is dispersing, just as you were saying, we need it.
dispersing.
Well, anyways, you said
we are spreading our talent through Whitehall, which is very something that we take great pride in. Yeah. Look, I didn't think I have not been trying to, actually deliberately not been trying to present a very gloomy picture. I think it is complicated and difficult, but what I'm trying to say is, look, we have to get on with it. We have to think it through very carefully and be pragmatic and hard-headed about it. But equally, I'm not espousing, as I say, the kind of catastrophic versions of things. But clearly, it's tough. It's a long process. It's a very complicated process. It is technically very difficult and therefore will be challenging for ministers and officials. And as we all know, there are some areas where we don't have a lot of expertise because we've actually done it through the EU, trade being one example. So it will be very difficult. I mean, I think that what I'll say about the British civil service, and I really think this is important, is they are incredibly loyal and highly professional. And even if they may not have chosen this outcome themselves, they will be loyal to ministers, and I hope ministers will recognise that, because I think ministers need to draw on the expertise of civil servants, including those who know the EU best, to help us through this process. And I think ministers can be assured of the absolute loyalty and high professionalism of the civil service, and that's a very important point. Now, I think if you're a civil servant and if you want to make your career in the civil service over the next 5 years, then this is the issue in town, it will absorb an awful lot of activity, whether it is in the central departments or whether it is across government, be it in DEFRA or in BEIS or in the Foreign Office or in the Treasury, because different areas of deep expertise will be drawn on and coordinated and brought together in its negotiations. So, I think any aspiring civil servant is going to have to look at this and say, I need to be across this, even if I'm not at the heart of it. It's going to be the context in which I'm working over the next few years. And then as for individuals, I mean, there may be some who say, this is not what I choose to spend, years of my life doing. That is an individual choice for individuals, just as we all make career choices. I don't know whether that will happen or not, but I think that actually an awful lot of very bright people will get involved and will really make the best of it.
Thank you. And there was one here.
Yes, hello. This is Martin, German Embassy. A bit more detached from the negotiations. My question would be, what is your view on where the UK will develop in terms of, it seems to me there's a squaring of a circle on the one hand saying I want to be the global leader on free trade, deregulation and all that, and on the other hand this talk on a country that works for everyone, losers of globalization, a lot of people that have voted for leave, probably not prepared for a very deregulated country. So, and I'm leaving the budget issues aside, so how is this circle going to be squared, or in which direction is the country moving? Thank you.
Well, it's a very good question. I think the key, a very important issue here is that if our economy doesn't perform strongly, then solving all the other issues is going to be that much more difficult. The issues around inclusion, the issues around inequality and all the social problems which are identified in this country, and by the way exist in other countries in Europe and the United States as well. And we have a broader challenge. I mean, Brexit is an issue, it's a symptom of a wider set of issues, I think, and we have a shared broader challenge to deal with that, just as countries on the continent have these terrible difficulties over youth unemployment. So we have different manifestations of it. So I do think that we need to be realistic about the importance of our economic performance in future. And I think that is one of the challenges of Brexit, because I suspect that we will take an economic down before we achieve an up, if we're going to achieve one through the reorientation of our economic relationships and the sort of restructuring of our economy. But the two things are not necessarily contradictory, and I think that what the government would argue is that in leaving the EU, they will have more capacity and freedom of movement to introduce policies to address some of the problems that they perceive in this country, most notably, of course, concerns about freedom of, about movement of people within the European Union, so to address those problems, whilst also seeking to establish a new sort of economic model, international economic model for the UK. But I'm not, for one moment, going to suggest that that is not a very difficult set of challenges that we're going to be facing. It is.
There's one here on the edge.
Hi, Corey Preston, DEFRA. So it seems to me that there's some kind of assumption that if we don't get an agreement with the EU, or if we don't get one quick enough, we'll just be able to easily revert to WTO rules or terms of membership. If we just imagine for 1 second that it's not that simple and easy, do you kind of, with your ex-job kind of hat on, do you have any sense of which countries might be more challenging or might wish to cause us trouble in that endeavour?
What, in the whole negotiation?
In establishing ourselves with the WTO.
Oh, in the WTO system? No, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that, honestly, because I haven't really thought about it in detail, but I'm not sure that is the big issue. I think that the first question is, how are we going to establish the right sort of negotiating relationship with our other European member states to get the sort of psychology of that negotiation right? Because of all the people who are going to be able to make our life difficult, that is the first group, if they want to. More broadly in the WTO, it's a very good question, and I don't know, I haven't thought about it enough, but can I take it away and think about it? You're right, we mustn't make any assumptions about these things.
I think we've come to, all right, one more, last one at the edge here. Thank you.
Well, I don't understand that. David Middleton. I don't understand that last comment, we mustn't make any assumptions. Surely we must make assumptions. I mean, what's the alternative? We're out of the EU, we're not able to trade under the WTO rules for some reason. Aren't we allowed to trade in the world at all? That seems to me inconceivable.
The question that I was asked was about the positions of individual member states in relation to our WTO position, and I don't know the answer to that. So what I was saying is we mustn't make the assumption that it's going to be easy, which was what the question was about. But I absolutely agree with you that what we've got to do, looking at all these uncertainties ahead, is that we've got to try and create a roadmap and work out what we think our desirable options are, more desirable options, and pursue them. I agree with that, absolutely. But we're not in control of all the pieces, far from it.
No, but my basic assumption is Adam Smith's. There's a great deal of ruin in a nation. Let's not panic.
No, and I agree with that. Let's not panic. We absolutely shouldn't panic. I completely agree with that.
Simon, may I just ask finally, really come to the end now, whether you think that the British exit will change the European Union and the Commission in particular in attitudes to other countries coming in, and even possibly to the threat of others leaving, and I'm thinking of the possibility, some would say likelihood, of another Eurozone crisis.
Well, I think that as I said earlier, I think the European Union has got to sort of understand and react to Brexit, and that hasn't really happened yet. And you're absolutely right to point out there's a whole range of other things going on in Europe, and it's very important to remember that actually, as our German colleagues and others will tell us, if you look at, we're not top of the agenda for that. I mean, there are other things which are higher on their agenda in terms of their own interests, and it's important for us to remember that. I suspect that we will go through a period of sort of consolidation in the EU now. I don't think that there will be a big momentum for much deeper integration. I think it'll be about sort of, if you like, damage limitation and making sure that the European project as it's described, carries on. So the existing plans for enlargement, I think, will continue, but of course we have been traditionally one of the great drivers of that. I think sort of continuity, but we shouldn't expect that the European Union will be a sort of status quo, and that we will be negotiating with a European Union which is not at the same time evolving and developing as we go along.
Thank you. On that note, well, look, Simon, thank you very much for this very studiedly careful message of don't panic. As you say, you're not a catastrophist, but you've taken us through the intricacies, undeniable intricacies of this process. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks for the terrific questions. And can you join me in thanking Simon Fraser?